Do you sometimes feel like you're stuck and you don't know why? Like there's something in the way, but you can't quite figure it out? Well, today in this video, we're gonna go over the concept of the shadow self. The invisible part of us that often works against us in terms of what we want most out of life. This shadow side holds emotions, thoughts, and fears that we may have hidden or ignored, yet they can shape our very decisions, the beliefs we embrace, and even the way we see ourselves. By understanding these hidden forces, you'll gain insights into how they influence you, and more importantly, how to move beyond them. This video will take a look at what's really going on below the surface. The shadow self are the parts of us that we find unacceptable. We try to repress them, we try to hide them. It's stuff that we're not proud of. So if you feel laziness, sadness, anger, selfishness, it's these things that you see as flaws and weaknesses in yourself. An idea that's really important to understand as it relates to the shadow self is duality. And duality is something we have had throughout our history. If you look at it, there's always like two sides to something. And we'll talk about it as good or evil, up or down, love or hate, in and out, fire and ice. Just those are some of the many examples that are out there with duality. And in this here, the shadow self is the dark part of you, the other side of you, besides your true self. And in Chinese philosophy, I'm sure you're familiar with yin yang, okay? There's two sides there. In the Bible, they have good and evil. In recent times, Carl Jung popularized the idea in modern psychology of the shadow self. The shadow self is parts of ourselves that we have rejected, repressed, or denied. And these can be traits or emotions, things that we don't like about ourselves or things that we find unacceptable. So urges that we see are bad, memories that we find as undesirable or disgraceful. It can be shameful behaviors, poor attitudes, anything that's incompatible with our identity and how we present ourselves to the world. Basically, the shadow self is everything we find unacceptable about ourselves. But the shadow self is also the parts of us that we really don't want to confront or deal with. And so often what we do is we ignore them. And deep down, this causes us to feel inadequate and not our true selves. And let's look at a chart that explains this. Okay, on the left, you'll see the shadow self, and these are the parts of us we deny, reject, or hide, the parts of us we find uncomfortable or unacceptable, and as I said before, a part of us that we suppress. It shows up as destructive behaviors, self-sabotage, or unexplained emotional responses. I don't know about you, but for me, whenever I've seen dysfunction, it just has a ripple effect, and you try to counterbalance that dysfunction with something else. And in this case, when you have a shadow self that you have not addressed, what happens is you often create something called a persona to counterbalance that. And let's look at that right now. So a persona is on the right, and this is the image or personality you present to the public. It's like a mask you wear to be socially accepted. It's an idealized image we create to be liked and accepted. It shows up as trying to fit in, even when it doesn't align with our inner reality. In the middle is our true self, and that's where we want to be, so let's look at that. The true self is a fully integrated version of who we are. We live from inner authenticity rather than external expectations or repressing our true self. We have awareness of our shadow self and personas and work with them. You embrace both your strengths and your weaknesses, and you express yourself with authenticity and courage. What parts of yourself have you denied or rejected? This is what's running in the background of your life and self-sabotaging you. It requires you to be open and vulnerable to make the shift. To help you better recognize which category you might be in, let's look at this. First, the shadow self. Do I often react strongly to certain situations or people without knowing why? Am I judgmental or critical of traits in others I may secretly dislike about myself? Do I feel like I'm sabotaging my own success or repeating negative patterns? For the persona, am I more concerned with how others see me than how I truly feel? Do I feel like I'm playing a role or wearing a mask in my daily interactions? Am I constantly seeking approval or validation from external sources? The true self. Do I feel aligned with my inner values and beliefs regardless of external validation? Am I comfortable expressing both my strengths and vulnerabilities? Do I feel a sense of peace and authenticity even when faced with difficult situations? And let's look at some simple questions you can look at to help you to see which category you're in. How do I feel about failure or mistakes? If you view them with shame or anger, you might be in shadow territory. If you hide or gloss over mistakes, you might be operating from your persona. If you embrace them as learning opportunities, you're closer to your true self. Am I constantly trying to live up to others' expectations? A strong focus on external validation might indicate you're stuck in a persona. What triggers strong emotional responses in me? Triggers are often tied to shadow aspects. For example, if arrogance in others triggers you, it might point to repressed insecurity. Am I living in alignment with my values? If not, it's likely you're either in the persona, complying with others' expectations, or still unconsciously directed by the shadow. Let's look at what brings your shadow to the surface. It usually involves something to do with your identity, and your identity is being challenged, or you're having some kind of a strong emotional response. Things you've been trying to suppress or deny, but somehow, with all the tension and stress and things, they just boil up to the top. One of the ways is a trigger, and you have an over-the-top emotional reaction to something, and it could be anger, fear, shame, and your shadow begins to be activated here because something has stirred up inside of you. You're feeling the need to be protected or defended, and the shadow kicks in. And this can happen when you get criticized or rejected, and this unleashes this aggressive response in you that you normally keep hidden. The next one can be when you feel you're under stress or pressure. And what can happen here is your persona can take over and a mask can be there, but it starts to crack under the pressure and the stress, and it gives way to the shadow. The shadow emerges. So normally if you have a persona of being calm and cool and collected, well, that's going to end when the shadow self takes over, and you might explode into anger when you feel overwhelmed or when you feel criticized or something like this. This can also happen when your persona is holding everything together, having you have a good front here, but then something can happen like uncertainty. You can have uncertainty with a divorce could happen. You could lose your job. You could have a big setback, a health issue. Something could happen, and then what that persona of everything's fine, I'm doing well, could crack, and then the shadow self can take over here. Another way your shadow self can be brought to the surface is when you have failure or a mistake. And not just by yourself, but in the public here. Maybe it's at work, maybe it's in front of friends. And what it does is it makes you feel a lot of shame, and it makes you feel inadequate. And it forces you to confront aspects of yourselves that you really have not acknowledged. And your shadow has been trying to protect you and save face, but now you have come to this realization that, well, it's not right, this isn't working, and you feel really awkward and uncomfortable. The negative consequences of living with the shadow self and your personas are very costly. Number one, it's energy draining. It's just exhausting. When you're trying to suppress something, you're trying to suppress your shadow and at the same time build up your persona, that's exhausting, okay? And you have this internal conflict going on inside of you where you're trying to suppress something and pump something else up. And you feel fragmented and you can feel disconnected from yourself. Now, again, as I said, this is very exhausting and draining. But another thing is you will feel like an imposter syndrome when you're doing this. When you're being something you're not, when you're trying to suppress parts of yourself and then build up other parts that you really don't believe are you, but it's what you want to be accepted, that is very draining, and it makes you feel like you're an imposter. You can also have destructive patterns, and this is when unaddressed shadow elements create negative patterns such as self-sabotage, procrastination, addiction, unhealthy relationships. Until you face the shadow, you're stuck in a cycle of frustration. And you may be wondering why these same problems keep arising in your life. This is happening because you haven't addressed the root problem. And problems have a funny way of keep showing up until you resolve them. So a problem is going to keep showing up until you get the lesson or you resolve it. Next, we have identity crisis. The longer you live with personas and suppressing your shadows, the more disconnected you become from your true self. Over time, you can feel lost or unsure of who you really are. When the tension between the persona and the shadow becomes too great, it can lead to a crisis where you feel a need to find meaning and reclaim your authenticity. All the energy you spent suppressing your shadow and projecting your persona finally reached the breaking point. Another negative consequence of living with the shadow self and the persona is health problems. All the turmoil and tension inside you manifests or comes out as physical problems. Repressed emotions like anger, guilt, or fear can contribute to physical symptoms like chronic pain, headaches, fatigue, or digestive issues. Many people find that their health improves after resolving emotional blocks and suppressing feelings. It's stressful maintaining a persona and holding back your shadow self at the same time. This can weaken your immune system and make you more susceptible to illness and germs. Another negative consequence of the shadow self or your persona is a lack of fulfillment. You're living from a persona, and this means you're living to meet external expectations rather than following your true passions and desires. You feel empty and dissatisfied inside. And there's a void that happens inside you, and no shadow can fill that, and no persona can fill that. Only being authentic and your true self can fill that void. Here are some questions to reflect on about your shadow self. What traits do I dislike or criticize in others? Often the traits we strongly dislike in others are projections or qualities we have but refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. When do I feel strong emotional reactions, such as anger, jealousy, or sadness, out of proportion to the situation? These intense reactions may be indicators of something repressed in your shadow. What recurring thoughts or patterns keep me stuck in the same place? Look for self-sabotaging patterns or limiting beliefs that may stem from suppressed emotions or unresolved past experiences. What behaviors or thoughts do I try to avoid or deny in myself? Reflect on what makes you uncomfortable about yourself or what you're unwilling to admit. This could include feelings of inadequacy, shame, or vulnerability. What are my biggest fears about myself? Are there aspects of yourself that you're afraid to reveal? Often this hides shadow aspects, such as not feeling good enough, weak, or unworthy. When do I feel the need to wear a mask to fit in or to be accepted? This can help you uncover aspects of your persona that hide your authentic self. What are you afraid of if you were to drop the mask? What part of myself do I suppress to be good or accepted by others? Explore the behaviors, desires, or feelings you suppress because they don't fit the image you want to project. How do I respond to failure, criticism, or rejection? Reactions like defensiveness, blame, or self-criticism often point to your shadow aspects. Reflect on how these responses are protecting you from deeper emotions like fear or insecurity. What do I envy in others? Envy often points to desires or qualities that you've denied or feel unworthy of having yourself. What is my inner dialogue when I'm alone or faced with a challenge? Shadow aspects often reveal themselves in negative self-talk, self-criticism, or feelings of inadequacy. If you're trying to work through this, sometimes what I found effective is to ask your shadow, what are you trying to protect me from? And it's going to reveal some core fears or some wounds that you have been buried and they're deep within you here. So when that happens, be ready for it and anticipate it. What you're trying to do here is allow it to be released so that your highest, best self can emerge. Because when you do that, then that true self in the center column, that's the one that you're going to be living from. And just think of it as like water returning to the ocean after a long journey. Your shadow self and your persona, those energies, those parts of you, those elements, they can be released and they can be merged back into your true self. If you're still finding resistance letting go and releasing the shadow self and your persona, know that you still have some fear attached, because fear is always attached to the shadow self. So it could be fear of the unknown, fear of losing control, fear of being vulnerable, but there is some kind of fear that is attached to your shadow self and it's not willing to let go. So figure out what that is and how can I release that. Here's some questions to help you if you're still feeling resistance. So you can ask yourself, what am I afraid of if I let go of this? And that could apply to the persona or the shadow self. What part of my identity do I feel I'm losing? What has this persona or shadow self done for me in the past? What new identity or strength is trying to emerge? Am I willing to give all my energy to my true self? A real breakthrough comes when you can turn things around for yourself. And you do that by taking something that was working against you and having it work with you and for you. You have something that was an adversary and you turn it into an ally. And you can do that. And if you feel drawn to this and this stuff has like touched you and you're like, man, I know I have some shadow work to do. I have some personas I've created. If you want to work on that and clear that up and become a better, higher version of yourself, what I recommend is my partner, Janell. This is an area she's an expert in. She's helped many people do this. And her email is janell@janellray.com, or her website is janellray.com. And I'll put that in the description. She is someone who has helped me, and she can help you too. If you have felt connected to this at all, like this shadow work is something that I feel like, this is something inside of me that's dragging me down, holding me back, I highly recommend you reach out to her. You will not be disappointed. I hope you reach out to Janell if that did speak to you. Again, thank you for watching this video, liking it, subscribing, writing a comment. I really appreciate that. All the best to you.